So in this module, we'll be covering sampling techniques. Let's take a look at first a list of the supplies and equipment you'll need to have. We take a look, and first thing is your air pump. You're going to need to get testing equipment before you can get out there in the field. So you have your air pump, you have your wall cavity hose, an extension cord, adapter. What would an adapter be for? Well, you better make sure if you get into a house that's only got a 2-prong outlet and your pump's requiring 3-prong, that you have an adapter to use with you. Carrying case, clipboard would be good to be able to write down the forms and the agreements that you'll need. Carpet square, we'll go over that in a little bit. Plastic bags, I recommend Ziploc. The reason for that is because the Ziploc bag is terrific to be able to put all your samples in, and it has a place right on it where you can write the address. It also zip locks so that your samples can't come flying out when you put them down someplace or have them in the car. It's also waterproof so your samples don't get wet. So I think Ziploc is a good way to go to put your samples in. The next is direct ID. What's direct ID? Well, there are two methods in which to take a direct ID sample. That means directly identify the mold off the surface area. So you've got two types of surface that you're typically working with. One is a painted smooth surface, such as a sheetrock wall or a trim board that's been painted. That would be best to use a tape strip with. The reason why you want to use a tape strip is because it won't slide when you go to take your sample. So on these surfaces, what you're going to do is you're going to take your slide out of the container, and it's got a little plastic covering on it. You're going to peel that black plastic covering back and take it right off the slide. And once you do, then you're going to have just a sticky surface here. Take this sticky surface and apply it to your surface area where the mold is, and then go ahead and put your covering back on. Don't forget both with the air samples and the direct ID. Before you take your sample, go ahead and write right on here where you're taking your sample from, so there's identification on the slide of where the sample is coming from. Once you've taken that sample, you put it back into your case. Take the case, close it so it's protected, no cross-contamination. Put that in your Ziploc bag. And that should go to your clean space. The next one is where we do a direct ID from a non-painted surface, such as a subfloor, roof sheathing, or rafter attics. That's when you're going to use a swab. The swab comes in a container like this. What you're going to do is open the outside seal, and it's going to come in two pieces. You're going to take the cap off, maybe put it in your pocket. You're going to take the swab and dip it into the tube. At that point, I recommend that's when you write on the location where you're taking your sample. From there, there's a sponge on the bottom of the swab. That sponge has a liquid solution in there. You squeeze it so it encompasses the bottom of the swab, or the Q-tip end. That allows the mold to adhere to and stick to the swab without branching off and becoming airborne. Take the swab out, and this swab is intended to roll across the surface area. I find it best to be able to use two hands to do this, and roll with one finger and your other hand across the surface area, typically about 1 inch or less, until you've encompassed all of the tip of the Q-tip. Put it back in your container and then you're good to go. And this goes where? In your plastic bag, gets sealed. The other reason why you want to seal it, particularly for the swabs, is if you get that swab wet on the outside, the ink is going to smear and nobody's going to know where you took your sample from. Put that in the plastic bag, put that in your clean space, and if you have to go take another sample, then you go from there. That's your direct IDs. Then you've got your air cassettes. Air cassettes come in a couple of types. Aerosol is one of the most common ones. Z5 is another common one. The aerosol is a good quality cassette. How this works is in the center there is a screen which has sticky substance on it. When the air gets drawn through the cassette, the spores get trapped on the screen and then they can be read in the microscope. This gets put on your air pump and the hose goes in on one end. That runs over through your stand and over to your pump. We'll show you that so that you can go through the sampling techniques in a moment. Let's get back to our list of equipment and supplies. The next piece of equipment that you're going to need is the hose that connects to the pump. You'll also need a moisture meter and a hygrometer. These are very important. Inspectors like to be able to have tools, but sometimes not too many tools. But these two tools are very important. Let me explain why. When you're doing your water intrusion assessment, you're going to need to know if what looks to be wet is wet currently. Now, don't mistake in that means the leak has been fixed. It only means at the moment that it's wet or it's dry. The next part to it is the hygrometer. The hygrometer is important because we need to know what the humidity is in that indoor environment at the time of your test. So it's important for all of us to know that this is just a snapshot in time, a moment in time at the time that you're there during the inspection. But we do the best we can with the time frame that we have. So again, the hygrometer will help give us some information. We want to know what the humidity is like outside and what the humidity is like at the area you're testing. Probe. A probe is important because when you take your wall cavity sample, you're going to need a probe if you are going to pop the end of that tube off. We'll show you that in a moment. The probe is typically a long metal piece you can use a coat hanger wire, but it's usually a small, thin probe. Screwdrivers. Phillips screwdriver and flathead are important because you never know what kind of outlet plate, switch plate you might have to take off to take a wall cavity sample, and you don't know what kind of screw they're going to have on it. Make sure that you have your stand for your pump, gloves to protect your hands and not contaminate things. You want to make sure you have Tyvek coveralls because if you've got to get into a crawl space and the crawl space is damp, you really don't want to get that all over your clothes and then go traipsing through the house with all of the dust, dirt, water, and mold spores being carried all over the house. So bring those Tyvek suits. Flashlight is going to be important. And then, of course, your camera and ladder. Now, I got a call from a gentleman saying, hey, Dave, I took your mold class, and I'm out at a job site, and I need to take a sample in the attic. I said, okay, how can I help you? I didn't bring a ladder. Bring all your equipment with you. Make sure you have all of it before you get out there. Be prepared. The last on the list is boards for the attic. When you get into an attic area and there's no flooring, it makes it very difficult to get down into the eaves if you have to take a sample. So what I suggest is get a 4x4 sheet of plywood. 1/2 inch is fine. Cut it in half so you've got 2x4. That'll fit almost any hatchway so you can get up into the attic and put it down for flooring. You get down on one, move the other in front of you, and keep moving them until you get to your location to take your samples. So now that we finished up our list and we make sure we have proper supplies, then we go into the steps involved in sampling. We take a look and decide what samples are needed. This is very important because you want to know what supplies you're going to need for that, and you're going to want to know what you're trying to prove and what you're trying to accomplish. Taking samples when you don't need to and you're not trying to prove something is not only a waste of your client's money and a waste of your time, but it's going to come back to bite you at some time because someone's going to find out and they're not going to be happy about it. Next thing is, how many samples do you need, and get those prepared. Each sample should be done in accordance with the lab and manufacturer's specification, meaning how you use them and where you use them. Make sure that you are ready and prepared to defend your position in court in case you ever get called. It's unlikely to happen, but it could happen, and you want to make sure that you're prepared in that event. Let's talk about taking samples. Surface samples is the next one. Understand that all of the supplies that you get from the lab, your direct ID swabs, your direct ID tape, and your cassettes are all time sensitive. That means two things. First is it only lasts so long. They have a shelf life. And the lab will tell you what that shelf life is, and they'll usually have a date stamped on them. So make sure you don't let it get past that date, because if the lab puts on the report that it's past its date, you're not going to be able to use that. Second component to that is you don't want to take samples and let them sit around for a week. They have got to get to the lab as quickly as you can. So send those airborne next day so that the lab can do their process quickly. When you're doing a swab sample, we talked about the amount of sampling you want to do and how to do those samples. Make sure that you wear gloves so that you don't contaminate it. Make sure that you cap it properly and put it back into the plastic bags. Understand that these are really meant for identifying the type of mold and not the amount of mold that you have. And the identification of the mold is only of the area that you swab. It's not going to be multiple areas. Nor do you want to take that swab and do a little dab here and a little bit dab there and another one over here. It is of one specific area. So if you have other areas that have mold, you may want to take more than one sample. The more data you have, the more able you are to determine what's going on and what molds you have in that area. Now we take a look at our room samples, our air samples. First is you want to make sure that the samples are taken at the same height. You want to make sure that they're of a breathing space. You don't want to put one on the floor and one on top of a refrigerator because there are other forces that would come into play that could alter the results. So the best thing is to use your stand, set your stand at that elevation, and move it throughout all of your samples. So then the question comes up, well, Dave, what if I'm taking a wall cavity sample? That's a different type of sample, and that can be at a different elevation. But for the air samples that you're taking, you want to make sure there are not other influences involved. Best location to take it, if you have an HVAC system, warm air or air conditioning, about 5 feet from the return in that room is usually best. But you also want it close to where you have the contamination. So if you see the contamination is on the opposite side of a very large room, like an auditorium, from an HVAC return, then I'd rather you take it in the area where the contamination is than over by the HVAC system. However, it is best to run the HVAC system for a few minutes prior to taking your test. Also, you want to make sure that if you are doing a carpet sample, that you have a carpet square, which ends up being 6 inches square. When you take your carpet square and you take your sample from it, you are not going to drag that sample back and forth. You're going to drag it once across, pick your sample up, Start over again, going left to right until you have completed that square. That will give the volume and the amount that you need to be able to take a proper carpet sample. Wall cavity samples. In a wall cavity, there can be a lot of dust and debris. You don't really know what that condition is because you don't have access to it. So we find somewhere between 30 seconds and a minute provides a good value in a wall cavity sample. Next, every time you take an air sample on the inside, you need to be able to take an air sample on the outside. This gives you a benchmark for what you're looking for. So on the outside, when you take your outside sample, you don't want to get any contamination from inside the house influencing that outside sample. So how are we going to do that? Well, the best way to do that is take your sample 10 feet from the outside wall on the windward side of the house. Therefore, you're not going to get any influence from what's going on inside the house in your sample. When you take the outside sample, you want to make sure that you don't take it during windy conditions, rain, snow, frozen conditions on the outside, and especially don't take it when your neighbor is mowing the lawn and all the grass is blowing around you. You don't want to take it when you have a farmer tilling his property and all the dust and dirt is flying in the air. Be practical with it. Understand what you're trying to achieve and look around you before you take your sample. The next thing is if you can't take it on the outside and you have to take it on the inside, you want to be able to take it on the inside in an area where people are not complaining of sickness or in the furthest area, living area, away from where your mold, contamination, or problem area has been cited. Don't take it in a garage. I get a lot of people calling me about taking air samples that are outside in the garage because it was raining outside. Well, the garage has vehicles in it that have brought all kinds of things in. That's a very different influence, and in fact, many garages have a walkthrough to the house, and so you're going to get cross-contamination there. Stay out of the garage with your control sample. Now let's talk about the air samples and the time that you're going to be taking them. When you take your air sample, 10 minutes is optimum on an aerosol. 10 minutes gives you the optimum amount of data at 15 liters of air when you're running it through the pump. Sometimes, if a house has a lot of debris in the air, look through and see if it's a dusty, dirty environment. And if you see fur balls blowing across the floor and all kinds of dust particles in the air or construction's been going on there, probably better bring it down to 5 minutes. Because if you don't bring it down to 5 minutes, what you're going to find is the background debris is going to be too high, and in all likelihood, the lab is not going to be able to run the results. Or they'll say they could not get a good result, and so they recommend you do further testing. Now, there is a protocol. The protocol by IESO identifies 3 time periods for these aerosols. The first one is if you have a calm environment, no visible particulates in the air, that's when 10 minutes is appropriate. But if you have active environment, occupied indoor house, breezy conditions outside, then you want to bring it down to 5 minutes. That may be many of the times when you're going out and test. If you identify that it's a highly active environment with lots of particulates in the air and maybe lots of animal debris around, very dirty environment, you may want to bring it down to 1. So those are the standards that they've helped set for running air tests and air samples through that cassette. Now we take a look at making sure that you label everything and that you put it in your plastic bag, seal it, and don't forget to put your chain of custody in there and then send that to the lab together. To run our air samples, the first thing you're going to do is set up your stand. When you set up your stand, you want to make sure it's at the same height, and you want to make sure it's within breathing zone, knee high to head high. That's a good standard to follow. And so if you're doing that, once you set the height of your stand, you can go ahead and take your hose from the pump and set that into the stand. There's an opening. Run it through the stand till it's about 4 inches out the other side. From there, turn on your pump and make sure that the meter is showing that you're at 15 liters of air. From there, you'll take your cassette, label your cassette, take your tabs off. You're going to find when you take your tabs off and roll them back to get them out of the way, you're going to have 2 different sides to them, or ends, if you will. One end is going to be round. The round end is the end that connects to your hose. The other end is the square or rectangular end. That's the end that has the screen in it that will draw the air through and trap the mold spores to it. We then take that cassette, and I find the best way to get it to hook to the hose is to turn it or twist it just a little bit. Make sure it's on there snug so it doesn't fall. Once it falls, it's contaminated. Put that one away, start again. Then at this point, you're ready to go and turn the pump on. So we're going to turn the pump on, check the meter, and run it for how long? 5 minutes. When we're done with that, we'll take the cassette off and we'll put it in our clean bag. When I put these labels back on them, I try to push them down so they're fully sealed. From there, it's labeled. It's got the seals on both ends. Put it in my plastic bag. Goes in my clean space. Or if you're done, you finish filling out the chain of custody, put it in the bag, you're ready to airborne it to the lab. So we talked about the chain of custody. Let's take a look at this chain of custody. What is a chain of custody? A chain of custody is just that. It's identifying who had custody of those mold samples all the way through the process. It's usually a couple of people, but it could be 3. So when you take your samples, you're going to sign the bottom of it. Maybe someone from the office handled it, so then they sign. And then you send it airborne, goes to the lab, and then they sign when they receive it. So that's what a chain of custody is, the chain of people that had custody of those samples. Very important document. Now this chain of custody here is a Testall made chain of custody. There are some important components to this that you need to know. First one is all chain of custodies are going to have your name and information on it. But this also has Testall on it, so that when the samples go into the lab, they know to email us the results so we can get going on the report right away. Next component is the area you tested. What was the address in which you tested? Make sure you fill that out completely. Who sampled it? We need to know that as well. And then it's asking for what the weather conditions were at the time of your sampling. Make sure you fill that out, check any appropriate boxes. Health conditions. What about the people that are occupying that space? Was there complaints? What were those health issues? Next, you're going to put down in this graph area, in this charted area, you're going to put the serial number of the aerosol down, where you took your sample, how many liters of air, typically 15, for how many minutes, 5 minutes, and then you're going to say that it was an AOC, meaning aerosol. It's a type of equipment you used. Next, put any notes in. This note section is really important because if you find the area is really wet or extremely dusty, help us out and tell us that information. If construction was going on in that office area while you did your testing, let us know that information there. Then the other thing is we put right over up here, there are 2 check boxes. One that says pre-test and the other that says post-test. We want to know, is this prior to remediation or after remediation? Please make sure you fill this out completely. Keep a copy for yourself, then take this, fold it, put it in your plastic bag, and this goes where? Right, in your clean space. When you're all done, then that gets airborne to the lab, overnighted. That way, everything can be expedited in a professional manner. We appreciate providing this class for you. I hope it's been informative and helpful. Now it's time for you to go take your material list, put it together, make sure that you've gone through the experience of filling out the questionnaire with Testall, make sure you understand what you need to get for agreements and forms, get those together, and then go have fun and make money.